Hey there, folks. How you doing? Welcome to Kooks, Crakes, and Iconoclast, the podcast. And I am your host, Mike Locke. And boy, I'm still sick. And I feel like shit. But here's a goddamn episode because that's how dedicated I am. And I need to escape reality. I had to call a fucking ambulance the other night. Like 4 in the morning. Because I thought I was, I don't know what I fucking thought. I don't know what the fuck was going on. I don't know. Still feel shitty. Probably will for a good, I have no idea how long. Supposed to talk to my doctor in a couple days. Figure out what's going on. But anywho, enough of that sad sack horse shit. Hey, let's get into the horrors of the microcosm. Starting with this first of 2 parts. Little episode I like to call I Got Worms. Worms with a Y. Let's go. When you step back from the carapaces, the pincers, and the skittering legs, a harrowing truth begins to take shape. The ultimate horror of the insectoid world isn't just that they outnumber us, or that they grow to impossible sizes in deep caves, or even that they manifest in the terrifying shape of alien overlords. You know they do. The ultimate horror is intrusion. It's the violation of the perimeter. It's the horrifying realization that the boundary between you and the outside world is far more fragile than your ego would like to admit. We looked at mantis aliens in past episodes. We're going to look at some more insectoid monstrosities in the next one, but this one, it's no accident that when humanity gazes out into the cosmos to picture the ultimate other, quote-unquote other, an entity stripped of all human warmth, we almost always imagine a bug. In sci-fi lore and abduction accounts, the insectoid alien reigns supreme as the apex predator of the uncanny valley. We whisper about the mantis being 7 foot tall, towering telepaths, standing motionless, psychosurgical sex cannibals, I believe I called them last time, and they're the good guys. Standing over surgical tables, observing human suffering with the cold, detached curiosity of an entomologist under glass, shoving that fucking needle right through a goddamn butterfly. We dread the hive mind. I especially dread the hive mind. A horrible psychedelic experience I had once. Anyways, that unstoppable collective consciousness where the individual is worthless. Empathy is an evolutionary defect, and the swarm exists solely to consume biomass and build the next brood. Sound familiar? Reminds me of some people I know. Their chitinous armor deflects our weapons. Their unblinking compound eyes see light we cannot comprehend, and their mandibles are built purely for mechanical harvest. Insectoid aliens terrify us because they represent biological totalism. You can see reason with a mammal. A mammal understands fear, territory, or even maternal instinct. But a chitinous entity operates on pure unfeeling efficiency. It doesn't hate you. It simply views your cities, your culture, and your flesh as raw fuel. We project our fear of cosmic irrelevance onto chitinous feats descending from the stars to reclaim Earth. We build high-tech weapons in our imagination to fight giant carapaces and dream up dreadnoughts to blast mantis motherships out of the sky, but we've been looking in the completely wrong direction. Hang tight. It'll make sense. What happens when the entity doesn't wait outside the door? What happens when the invasive species drops the heavy armor, shrinks down past the threshold of human vision, and sneaks inside through the air you breathe, the water you drink, or the skin on the back of your neck? Now, I remember saying this would be a little topical because that whole butt COVID going around right now, that's caused by a parasite. So maybe you know where I'm going with this. The most efficient colonizers on this planet don't pilot starships. They don't need giant claws. They operate at the cellular level. They ride inside the bellies of mosquitoes, sleep inside the soil beneath our fingers, and weave invisible subterranean intelligence networks beneath the forest floor. They're the worms and the worms. The kind with an O and the kind with the Y.
Spores, molds, and fungus.
Thanks, Egon. If the macro world of insects proves that nature is cruel, the microscopic world is about to prove something far more unsettling. Your mind may not belong entirely to you. So take a deep breath, wash your hands, check your pulse, wash your hands again, because it's time to take a trip inward. They're all up inside you right now, even as I speak. Even as you listen to these words, billions of microscopic entities currently inhabit your body, some beneficial, some benign, and some waiting, biding their time, perhaps. We call them parasites. What if that word is too small? What if we're really describing something far older and far stranger, something that blurs the line between biology and possession, between an infection and an invasion? This is the companion piece to what comes after this. That's just, I have to, this is the second one. Let me explain. Okay, this is the second one, but my stomach is like so sensitive. I can't do this, the first one right now, because it will just make me fucking hurl. And I got to come back. I got to do this one first, because this is a little bit later, and I'll come back and do the second one. So it's going to sound a little topsy-turvy. I apologize for that in some instances, but I will try to edit through that as best I can. Where the episode after this is going to examine the armored exoskeletons of the macro world, this journey will take us inward into the wriggling, pulsing, networked universe of the microcosm, into the realm of the worm and the worm. Count with the O, count with the Y. The fungus and the phantom, the parasite and the possessing entity. This is the story of life's most successful strategists and how they might be far more intelligent than we've ever dared to imagine. So let's begin with what is perhaps the absolute most unsettling truth that modern parasitology has revealed. Mind control is not science fiction. It's a biological reality practiced every day across ecosystems worldwide by organisms that don't even physically possess their own brains, at least not in the traditional sense. Consider Toxoplasma gondii. Pretty sure that's how you say it. I wonder what Gandhi's ghost thinks about that. A single-celled protozoan that's infected an estimated 1/3 of the entire human population. In rats, this parasite performs something that should be impossible. It rewires innate, hardwired fear responses. A healthy rat smells cat piss and experiences instinctive terror. I think we all do to a degree. An evolutionary survival mechanism carved into its neural architecture over millions of years of evolution. But here comes Toxoplasma, changing all that up. Infected rats lose their fear of cat odors. Some studies suggest that they may even become attracted to the scent of their natural predator. The result is, unfortunately for them, rather somewhat predictable. The rat begins to behave recklessly, eventually gets eaten, and thus the parasite completes its life cycle inside the guts of a cat. The mechanism, as documented in research published in Scientific Reports and Nature Communications, involves the parasite forming cysts in the brain, smashing the cyst, particularly in regions associated with fear and reward processing. The parasite may alter dopamine regulations, essentially hijacking the host's neurochemistry. As the American Society for Microbiology noted, the parasite, quote, overrides hardwired responses like fear of predators, unquote. And in humans, the data is more controversial, but no less disturbing. Studies have linked Toxoplasma infection to altered risk-taking behavior, changes in reaction times, and even correlations with certain psychological conditions. Research published in Scientific Reports found that individuals with latent toxoplasmosis show superior behavioral performance in challenging cognitive control situations, but may at the same time have a reduced sensitivity towards motivational effects or rewards. Interesting. Sounds like some other fucking maladies I know. The New York Times, in a 2014 article titled Parasites Practicing Mind Control, noted that the parasites, quote, can influence their behavior so much so that hosts can put themselves at risk of death, unquote. But Toxoplasma is only the beginning. Nature has organically evolved mind control in many forms, each more elaborate than the last. In the forests of Europe and Asia, crickets and grasshoppers fall victim to, oh boy, here we go, Spinochordotes tillini. Perfect. The hairworm. The parasite begins life is a microscopic larva ingested by the insect. Inside, it grows and grows until it reaches lengths 4 times that of its host's body, coiled and packed into the cricket's abdomen like, making John Wayne's colon look like a fucking ghost town, just waiting like a serpent. Ugh. When the worm reaches maturity, it needs water to reproduce. Crickets can't swim, so they avoid water. But the hairworm releases mind-controlling chemicals into the cricket's nervous system, compounds that override the insect's survival instincts and force it to seek out and plunge into water, where the worm bursts forth in a tangled knot, leaving its host to drown. Thanks, hairworm. As Wired magazine documented in 2014, the worms mind-control their host to make a kamikaze dive into water and then escape through holes bored in the insect's exoskeleton. Unquote. Research published in BMC Ecology and Proceedings of the Royal Society, oh man, I remember those guys, has shown that this manipulation involves specific proteins that alter the host's central nervous system, with the parasite literally controlling apoptosis, programmed cell death, within the host brain. The Lancet liver fluke, Dicrocolium dendriticum, yep, that's what I said, performs an even more precise manipulation. This flatworm's life cycle requires 3 hosts, a snail, an ant, and a grazing animal like a sheep or a cow. It's almost like a fairy tale. Inside the ant, something extraordinary happens. One fluke, rarely more than one, migrates to the ant's brain and insists there. But it doesn't destroy the brain, it pilots it. Delicious. The infected ant behaves normally during the cool hours of morning and evening, but when the sun rises and temperatures climb, the parasite forces the ant to climb to the top of a blade of grass and clamp down with its mandibles in a state of temporary tetany, frozen, exposed, and waiting to be eaten. Research published in Behavioral Ecology and Scientific Reports has shown this timing is precise. The parasite makes the ant avoid the hot midday sun, ensuring that the ant survives long enough to be consumed by the grazing animal. The brain-insisted fluke sacrifices itself so its brethren can complete the journey. This one's for you, bro. As the Natural History Museum documented, scientists have captured the first images showing these mind-controlling parasites in action inside an ant's head. And then there's the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. Fucking nailed it. The zombie ant fungus. This organism has become famous through popular culture, obviously, featured in the video game and television series The Last of Us, but the reality is stranger than fiction. When an ant becomes infected, the fungus doesn't invade its brain. Instead, as documented in research from Penn State University published in, quote, Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, unquote, fancy pantaloons, the fungus destroys the ant's motor neurons and connects directly to its muscles. The ant's brain remains intact, fully aware, fully conscious, a prisoner in its own body, while fungal cells form a 3-dimensional network throughout the body, collectively controlling the host's behavior. The ant is compelled to climb, to bite down on a leaf vein at a specific height and orientation, north-northwest, approximately 25 centimeters above the forest floor, where temperature and humidity are optimal for fungal growth. And there it dies. From its head erupts a stalk that releases spores to rain down on the colony below. As National Geographic has documented, quote, the fungus casts its mind control through bioactive compounds that interfere with the ant's nervous system and control hosts directly at the muscle fibers, unquote. These aren't isolated curiosities. They're representations of a fundamental strategy in the parasitic playbook, the manipulation of host behavior to serve parasitic needs. And they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of free will, agency, and selfhood. If those are even a thing. No, they are, but, this obviously has some play on that. If a single-celled organism can override a mammal's survival instinct, if a worm can force an insect to commit suicide, if a fungus can turn an ant into a puppet, what does this mean for our understanding of possession? Throughout human history, cultures worldwide have described possession by spirits, demons, and entities with the language of parasitology and the language of demonology share numerous striking parallels. Both describe entities that enter the body without consent, feed on the host, alter the host's behavior and personality, and resist expulsion, sometimes violently, often violently. Now, while Library of the Untold has done what I'm sure is a completely fucking awesome job through covering these fascinating and sometimes even terrifying parallels between parasitology and demonology. It's just about everything he and his team do is usually pretty fucking awesome. I've tried to avoid watching it for the time being, so as to avoid any potential conceptual cross-filtration. However, what is essentially an occult interpretation of parasitic infestation is most definitely one of the concepts that I very much wanted to look into for this specific segment of this episode. So, to begin, let's look at a strange bit of myth and folklore that's probably come up on this show in previous episodes during discussions of medicinal cannibalism and or Gu and Kodoku sorcery, one of my favorites. In ancient China, Taoist tradition spoke of the three corpses or three worms, the Sanqi or Sanchong. These weren't metaphorical concepts. They were understood as actual parasitic entities that inhabited the human body from birth, residing in the three Dantian energy centers, the head, the chest, and the abdomen. Ugh, I can feel my fucking worms right now. According to text documented on Wikipedia and in Taoist tradition, these, quote, three supernatural parasites, unquote, seek to hasten the death of their host, reporting the host's sins to celestial authorities and weakening the body to hasten mortality. The parallels to actual parasitic infection are rather uncanny. As anthropologist Sean Arthur noted in scholarly analysis of the three corpses tradition, quote, likely evidence for the belief was the fact that intestinal worms will evacuate the digestive system if they are not able to ingest enough sustenance. Otherwise, when intestinal parasites grow large, portions of them will break off and be evacuated in the feces, thus providing additional tangible evidence of their existence, unquote. Probably shouldn't eat before this. I guess I should have said that earlier. The Japanese Koshin tradition synthesized these Taoist concepts with Shinto and Buddhist beliefs, creating a complex cosmology of internal parasitic spirits that required specific rituals to suppress and expel. The Sanqi, as documented on yokai.com, are, quote, three spiritual worms found inside human bodies, unquote. Sorry, I'm having a flashback to brain candy. Entities that are simultaneously biological and supernatural, parasites and demons. This isn't merely ancient superstition. It represents a sophisticated attempt to understand phenomena that we now know to have real biological correlates. The itching of pinworms at night, the behavioral changes caused by parasitic infection, or the visible presence of expelled worms. These physical realities shaped spiritual and medical understanding for millennia. That's right. I know I'm talking about a lot of gross stuff here, but the second one is just going to... It's so much worse. Like, this I can handle for now. I've had cats my whole life. Whatever. The conceptual bridge between biology and the supernatural was by no means unique to the Far East. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, the dawn of medicine did not conquer demonology. Rather, it codified it. The earliest medical traditions of Mesopotamia, Greece, and medieval Europe frequently viewed parasitic worms not as mere symptoms of filth, but as physical manifestations of occult disruption, living, squirming proof that an external entity had breached the human perimeter. In the cradle of cuneiform medicine, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians operated under a healthcare dualism. Patients were treated by the Asu, a practical physician using herbs, and the Asipu, an exorcist priest utilizing incantations. These early healers, specific demons were directly equated with specific internal infestations. For instance, the demon Ashaku was blamed for wasting diseases of the bowels, while Akhazu, the Caesar, like when someone searches and seizes you, like a police officer, search and seize the Caesar, not, pizza, was a predatory female spirit responsible for liver failures and bile diseases. Modern veterinary and parasitological science recognizes these exact pathologies as severe liver fluke infestations, or fasciola hepatica, which humans contract from contaminated water. To the Babylonian mind, the physical flukes consuming the organ were the literal material claws of Achazu, working from within, the Caesar. Nowhere is this synthesis more explicit than in the famous Mesopotamian legend of the tooth worm, dating back to roughly 1800 BCE. The cuneiform text outlines a literal cosmology of a parasite explaining that after the gods created the earth, rivers, and marshes, the marshes birthed the worm. Big worm. Crying before the sun god Shamash, the worm demands a feeding ground, rejecting fruits and begging. Quote, "Lift me up, and between the teeth and the jawbone set me, that I may drink the blood of the teeth, and take away the strength of the gums." Unquote. To cure a toothache, the Asipu would recite this mythological origin story directly into the patient's mouth to bind the creature's spiritual essence, while the Asu applied a topical paste to kill the physical nerve-ending worm, quote-unquote worm, fusing dental surgery with an exorcism. As medical thought migrated to Greece, the secular framework of Hippocratic humorism began to take shape, yet the unsettling nature of parasites kept them tethered to the uncanny. Classical thinkers like Aristotle and later the Roman-era physician Galen meticulously categorized intestinal parasites into 3 distinct classes. Ascarides, or pinworms, Strongyloi, or roundworms, and Plateaei, tapeworms, fucking tapeworms. Galen argued that these creatures were generated via spontaneous generation, sprouting from putrefying humors and excess rot within the gut. Because these parasites arose from corrupted dead matter inside of a living host, they were viewed with immense metaphysical dread. They were seen as localized living decay, an internal subversion of the soul's command over flesh. By the Middle Ages, Western Christian scholasticism fully merged these classical biological observations with biblical demonology. The physical mechanics of a parasitic worm entering a host undetected, stealthily robbing it of nutrients, and causing the body to rot from the inside out, became the supreme theological metaphor for sin and demonic subversion. This wasn't merely literary flair. It was a deeply ingrained worldview. When Dante Alighieri mapped the geography of hell in his Inferno, he bypassed traditional monstrous imagery to describe both the 3-headed beast Cerberus and Satan himself as Il Gran Vermo, or the Great Worm, piercing the core of the world. We'll be further exploring the concept of great worms later on in this episode. In medieval clinical practice, when a patient suffered from the nocturnal itching of pinworms, sudden emaciation of a tapeworm, or the violent abdominal cramping of roundworms, the line between an apothecary's purge and an ecclesiastical exorcism entirely vanished. Doctors prescribed violently toxic, bitter purgatives, such as wormwood, crushed garlic, and poisonous pokeweed root, not merely to alter the gut's chemistry, but to make the human vessel so hostile and unpalatable that the invading demonic vermin would be forced to flee the body. In both the ancient East and the historic West, the diagnosis remained identical. Humanity was not alone in its own skin, and the devil was something you could physically pass in the night. Shit you out of here, devil. To Paracelsus, parasites. Yep, sorry. Okay, sorry. I had to make sure I did it right. To Paracelsus, parasites were the ultimate proof of spontaneous generation via putrefaction. When he gave this concept an alchemical spiritual twist in his work De Natura Rerum, or On the Nature of Things, he argued that when physical or spiritual matter rots, or putrefatio, it doesn't simply just dissolve. Instead, the life force or spirit inside that matter becomes twisted. He wrote that if a man lives a purely corrupted carnal life, his very bodily fluids and reproductive seeds, them sperms, would begin to decay while he's still alive. This alchemical corruption converts the human life force into physical parasites. Quote, "For if a man lives in sperm, his very sperms turn into worms and remain worms. Such births are more venomous and impure than are other worms." Unquote. I thought it was going to be a fairy tale also for a second. To Paracelsus, intestinal worms, toads, and lice weren't just external pests you caught from bad food. They were the physical crystallization of internal, moral, and alchemical decay. The worm was quite literally a person's inner sins taking on a physical, writhing form. If you look into old, exorcism literature, there's tons of shit about people just puking up frogs and shit like this, too. It's fucking weird. Paracelsus believed every human organ was governed by an internal alchemical spirit or force called the archeus, an internal alchemist that separates nutrients from waste. When a person was exposed to dark spiritual forces, bad air, or sinful desires, whatever that may fucking mean, the archaeus would become poisoned or inverted. Once the archaeus was corrupted, it could no longer regulate the body's base elements, these being sulfur, salt, and mercury. The excess, unrefined waste in the gut or the organs would then spontaneously quicken into parasitic life. In this sense, a tapeworm or roundworm was viewed as a physical parasitic thought form, a literal demonic seed that materialized in the flesh because the host's spiritual defenses had dropped. Because alchemists viewed parasites as semi-spiritual entities born of corruption, medieval and Renaissance alchemical medicine, known as iatrochemistry, treated them with extreme chemical aggression. They ain't fucking around. Paracelsus championed the use of inorganic, toxic minerals, like mercurial compounds, antimony, and sulfur. Shit that's just as equally good for your insides, I'm sure. Alongside intensely bitter herbs like wormwood. Ironic name, no? The philosophy behind these harsh remedies were pure occult logic. You had to introduce an alchemical substance so volatile and spiritually hostile that the demonic vermin would choose to evacuate the body rather than consume it. The cure was essentially a micro-exorcism using heavy metals. Probably in no way at all were they also highly toxic. Perhaps the most famous crossover between Paracelsus, worms, and manipulation is his recipe for creating a homunculus, a miniature artificial man. In his writings, Paracelsus notes that, I find this topic infinitely fascinating, I don't know why, but Paracelsus notes that the very first stage of creating artificial life in an alchemical flask requires burying human biological material in rotting horse shit for 40 days until it begins to putrefy. He notes that the very first sign of life to emerge from this alchemical rot is a transparent, wriggling worm-like entity, or formis humani. Only through further alchemical nourishment does this parasitic-looking worm eventually transform into a tiny human form. For the Renaissance alchemist, the boundary between a parasite, a demon, and the spark of life itself was completely fluid, up for grabs. They all crawled out of the exact same dark, putrefying ether, so fucking who cares? the ancient fluid boundary between the biological parasite and the demonic manipulator finds its most precise modern articulation in the intersection of Gnostic scholar John Lamb Lash's research and the paranoid visionary sci-fi of Philip K. Dick. And not in his image. Quote unquote, not in his image. Lash analyzes early Gnostic texts to define the archons not merely as mythological deities, but as literal psycho-spiritual parasites. An invasive extra-dimensional predatory force that lacks original creativity of its own, and survives instead by hijacking the human mind. This matches the haunting cosmic crisis documented by Philip K. Dick in his Valis trilogy, as well as his personal exegesis. Dick concluded that the human consciousness has been occluded or blinded by an irrational alien information system that mimics our own inner monologue so seamlessly that we mistake its prison warden commands for our own thoughts. For both Lash and PKD, the Archon is the ultimate cosmic tick, a mind parasite that alters the host's perception, feeding on human spiritual energy and sustaining a false reality by keeping humanity in a state of perpetual anxiety and self-doubt. By viewing the Archons through these esoteric lenses, the parasite ceases to be just a biological anomaly and becomes a cosmic archetype, an unseen interloper that stealthily overwrites the host's behavior from the inside. The call is coming from inside your body. While Lash and Dick map this hijacking onto the cosmos, modern research continues to uncover connections between parasitic infection and behavioral changes in humans. A nationwide cohort in Taiwan, published in ScienceDirect, found associations between pinworm infection and increased risk of psychiatric disorders. You don't say. Research has documented connections between parasitic infection and symptoms including, quote, hostile, aggressive, hyperactive, distractible behavior, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But if macroparasites, like pinworms, can actively nudge the human psyche toward hostility and distraction, what happens when we zoom in even further? What happens when we realize that our entire internal architecture is an inescapable, roiling sea of microscopic hitchhikers? This unsettling realization that the human ego might just be a meat puppet dancing to a chemical tune whistled by an invisible ecosystem moves us past traditional parasitology and straight into the realms of cosmic horror. It's an idea where modern biology and ancient occult anatomy collide, and no one has mapped this terrifying, beautiful micro-hell quite like comic book guru Grant Morrison. To understand how modern esotericism views the human boundary, we have to look at how ceremonial pop chaos mage of the scripted sequential art page, Grant Morrison, utilized the darkest corners of the Kabbalah, more appropriately the Qliphoth, to map human biology. In their seminal 2002 graphic novel, The Filth, author Morrison and artist Chris Weston bypassed the traditional superhero tropes to treat the human body as a vast macro-republic under siege. Morrison explicitly stated that the narrative was a literal metaphor for the human immune system, translating specialized white blood cells into shadowy, surreal espionage agency called the Hand, the cleanup crew tasked with wiping away the threats from the ass of civilization, no less, to our consensus reality or status quo. But the true occult subtext of The Filth lies in its relationship to the Qliphoth, the Kabbalistic tree of death, or the realm of chaotic, discarded shards and shells and shit that exists beneath our ordered, so fucking just perfect universe. In traditional Western Hermeticism, the Qliphoth is populated by demonic entities born from cosmic waste. In The Filth, Morrison and Weston visually and textually map this spiritual underworld directly onto our microscopic anatomy. The villains of the comic explicitly mock the protagonist, reminding him of that what humans call cleanliness or free will is just an illusion dictated by external germs. The comic notes that we're merely angels weighed down by filth. Our sweat, our shames, and our foulest of odors are manufactured by billions of tiny, unfeeling monsters endlessly fornicating and defecating on our skin. Like crabs in a bucket, pulling us down. This subversion creates a terrifying parallel to possession, when the inner voices, quote-unquote inner voices, of depression, self-loathing, or sudden violent impulses scream inside of a person's fucking head. They've been doing a lot to me lately. Morrison asks if those thoughts belong to the human soul, or if we're simply hearing the echo of the eternal germ whispering from our gut. By viewing the Qliphoth not as a distant astral hell, but as our literal sloshing internal microbiome, The Filth frames the human ego as a fragile synthetic construct, completely outnumbered by the alien life forms breathing around us and within us. When we strip away the occult metaphors and look strictly at modern biological data, the scientific reality is arguably more surreal than any goddamn comic book. For decades, humanity operated under the comforting assumption that our bodies were entirely our own. They're ours. It's mine. It's me. Hey, what's up? However, genomic sequencing has revealed that the human body is less of a singular individual and more of a walking, multi-species coral reef. Statistically, the cells containing your unique human DNA are actually in the fucking minority. You believe that shit? By strict cellular count, the human body is roughly 50% to 90% non-human, while older scientific estimates confidently claimed a 10-to-1 ratio of microbial cells to human cells. Refined modern census data puts the ratio closer to 1-to-1 or 1.3-to-1, meaning that even by conservative metrics, at any given second, more than half of the cells walking around in your clothes are completely foreign bacteria, fungi, viruses, and archaea. When we shift our focus from cell count to genetic code, the illusion of human identity vanishes almost fucking entirely. The human genome contains roughly 20,000 genes. The collective microbiome living inside us carries over 2 to 20 million microbial genes. Genetically speaking, you are less than 1% human. Don't you feel better? We are quite literally a microscopic Qliphothic shell built to transport an ancient, immortal ecosystem of primordial organisms. This leads us to the most unsettling frontier of modern medicine, the gut-brain axis. Ugh, my gut-brain axis is not doing well. A back-and-forth communication network that suggests our thoughts, intuitions, social behaviors are actively being puppeted from below. The human enteric nervous system, the mesh-like network of neurons lining our gastrointestinal tract, is so vast and autonomous that neuroscientists routinely call it the second brain. Very imaginative name, I'm sure. This second brain contains over 100 million neurons, more than the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system, Strikingly, the biological engine produces over 95% of the body's serotonin and 50% of its dopamine. Holy shit, I need to be taking fucking, what do you call that shit? Whatever. The primary neurotransmitters that dictate human joy, fear, anxiety, and motivation. Because our gut microbes have direct access to this neural pipeline, they possess what can only be described as a form of somatic intuition or psychic control over the host. Through the vagus nerve, the direct highway connecting the gut to the cranium, microorganisms can actively alter gene expression in the brain, manipulate food cravings to feed themselves, and dictate emotional states. Nowhere is this interrelationship more profoundly studied than in contemporary research surrounding neurodivergence, specifically autism spectrum disorder, ASD. Clinical data has consistently shown a staggering correlation between ASD and distinct altered gut microbiomes. Children on the spectrum routinely exhibit significantly different ratios of specific bacteria, such as an overabundance of Clostridium or a depletion of beneficial Bifidobacterium, compared to neurotypical peers. When researchers transplant the gut microbiota of autistic humans into mice, the animals suddenly begin to exhibit classic neurodevelopmental and psychosocial shifts. Severe social withdrawal, repetitive grooming behaviors, and heightened anxiety. The implications of this are staggering for any study of entity manipulation. It suggests that our very capacity for human empathy, language, and social bonding isn't an isolated achievement of the human intellect. Rather, our social realities and neurodevelopmental frameworks are deeply tethered to the health, whims, and chemical secretions of the alien colonies dwelling within our bellies. In your belly. Feel those kicks? Gotta be a soccer player. But still, we must go deeper, deeper, and deeper. Beyond the individual parasites, beyond the individual host, there lies something larger and far stranger. The network, the web, the mycelial matrix that connects all life. Enter Minakata Kumagusu, born May 18th, 1867, in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. Died December 29th, 1941. Sad day. In the intervening 74 years, he became one of the most extraordinary polymaths in human history. A naturalist, ethnologist, linguist, and mycologist who spoke over a dozen goddamn languages. He studied at the British Museum and made revolutionary contributions to the study of slime molds, myxomycetes, that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, cognition, and boundaries between organisms. Minakata returned to Japan in 1901 after more than a decade abroad, settling in his native Wakayama to work from a home laboratory in the ancient forests of the Kumano region. Mountainous terrain, carpeted in subtropical vegetation, and traditionally viewed as the abode of ancestral spirits, kami. He conducted research that would place him among Japan's first true ecologists. It's documented by the Minakata Kumagusu Museum and in publications from Nippon.com. He collected specimens of slime molds and marine life, sending them to researchers including Guglielmo Lister in London, I think that's how you say it, and developed new species classifications that remain relevant today. But much like the infamous pioneering rocket scientist Jack Parsons, Minakata's scientific work was inseparable from his spiritual framework. Operating within a syncretic Shinto-Buddhist worldview, he maintained that his path-breaking discoveries were facilitated by regular contact with non-human intelligences. The Tengu. Remember them? The birdie guys in the mountains? Avian humanoid mountain spirits, and kami, or localized nature deities. According to accounts from the Library of Congress and the Minakata Kumagusu Museum, Minakata would slip into deep, fugue-like trance states in the ancient forests. In these altered states, he maintained that Tengu entities would physically guide him through the dense undergrowth, pointing out incredibly rare, uncatalogued species of fungi and slime molds that were completely invisible to standard botanical search methods. The museum's own documentation notes that when Minakata failed to appear at school for several days, rumors spread that he had been, quote, kidnapped by a Tengu monster while collecting specimens in the mountains, unquote. To modern ears, this sounds like mysticism, superstition even, psychological disturbance maybe. But Minakata treated these experiences as empirical reality. He was not a fantasist. He was a rigorous scientist whose work was respected by that hawkish god among men, Emperor Hirohito himself, sorry, take me back to my Occult Crime Atlas Japan, who invited Minikata to deliver a private lecture on slime molds aboard the Imperial yacht Nagato in 1929. But what if we were to take Minikata's report seriously? Not as evidence of supernatural entities, but as evidence of something equally strange: communication with non-human, non-animal intelligences that he interpreted the cultural framework available to him. Consider what we now know about slime molds, specifically Physarum polycephalum, the species Minikata studied most extensively. Even though it's a single-celled organism with no brain and no nervous system, it can solve mazes, remember paths, and make complex decisions by communicating through a pulsing rhythmic network of tubes. It's the ultimate real-world example of a decentralized, many-headed intelligence operating completely outside of human frameworks. Despite having no brain, no nervous system, and no centralized processing organ of any kind, slime molds demonstrate capabilities that we associate with intelligence. Research published in Nature and FEMS Microbiology Reviews, or FEMS, have documented that slime molds can solve mazes, optimizing routes between food sources with the efficiency of human engineers. When researchers placed oat flakes at the entrance and exit of a maze, the slime mold redistributed its biomass to find the shortest path, quote, withdrawing from dead ends and longer paths until a single tubule connected the food sources along the shortest path through the maze, unquote. In 2010, researchers at Hokkaido University demonstrated that slime molds could design networks as efficient as Tokyo's railway system, creating optimal transport networks that matched human engineering solutions. As Nature reported, quote, the single-celled, brainless amoebae did not grow living branches between pieces of food in a random manner. Rather, they behaved like a team of human engineers, growing the most efficient networks possible, unquote. Slime molds can learn. Research published in BioRxiv, I guess that's archive, I guess they say it, BioRxiv, and the Psychological Record as well, has demonstrated that Paramecium caudatum, and by extension, similar organisms, can form associations between lighting conditions and electrical stimuli, exhibiting what researchers call discrimination learning. They can make decisions between multiple options, performing what is essentially a form of cost-benefit analysis. They can even exhibit, quote, spontaneous alternation behavior, unquote, a pattern of exploration that suggests internal states analogous to curiosity or boredom. They're fucking sick of it. And they communicate through chemical signaling, electrical impulses, and the flow of cytoplasm that connects different parts of the organism into a coherent whole. Research published in ScienceDirect and Hyphal and Mycelial Consciousness has explored how fungi use electrical signaling for internal communication, signals that researchers at the University of the West of England have proposed could be translated into computing applications. So, just imagine that fucking monster movie. What Minikata experienced in those forest trances, what he interpreted as Tengu and Kami guiding him to rare specimens, may have been his subjective interpretation of communication with these distributed networked intelligences. These slime molds and fungi of the forest floor aren't individual organisms in the way that animals are. They're networks, vast, interconnected, and processing information through chemical and electrical signaling across scales of space and time that human consciousness can't easily perceive. When Minikata entered his trances and wandered the forest in altered states of consciousness, he may have been achieving something like what mycologist Paul Stamets calls tuning in, quote unquote, to the mycelial network, the wood wide web, quote unquote. Clever, no? That connects forest ecosystems and information sharing networks more complex than any human internet. From this perspective, the Tengu, quote, the Tengu, weren't supernatural beings, but emergent properties of ecosystem intelligence. Patterns that the human mind, lacking better categories, interpreted through the available cultural vocabulary. The Kami, localized nature intelligences, or genius loci, may be exactly what they were described as: the active, living consciousness of the ecosystem itself, expressed through the distributed cognition of fungal networks and slime mold colonies. Egon, one more time.
Spores, molds, and fungus.
Minicotta's concept of tact, a cultivated sensitivity to the webs of relationships in nature, as documented in the HAU Journal of Ethnographic Theory, may represent a practical methodology for achieving states of consciousness conducive to perceiving these non-human intelligences. His refusal to separate scientific from spiritual, quote unquote, knowledge may not have been pre-modern confusion, but postmodern wisdom. An understanding that the reductionist framework can capture the full reality of biological intelligence. If we adopt Minicotta's tact and open our minds to a framework where biology and the supernatural blur, we land squarely in the radical cosmology of psychonaut and ethnobotanist Terence motherfucking McKenna. McKenna didn't just view fungal intelligence as an earthly marvel. He famously posited that mushrooms, specifically psilocybin-bearing fungi, might actually be an advanced form of extraterrestrial life, or even a living organic alien technology. McKenna's translinguistic mycelium hypothesis argues that the mushroom spore is perfectly adapted for panspermia, the drifting of life across the vacuum of interstellar space. Protected by an outer shell rich in electron-dense melanin that can withstand deadly cosmic radiation, and capable of surviving temperatures hovering near absolute zero. A fungal spore is essentially a biological space capsule. McKenna suggested that millions of years ago, these spores drifted across the cosmos, rained down on a primitive Earth, and unspooled their subterranean mycelial networks into our soil. To appreciate the scale of this cosmic colonization, you only have to look at the jaw-dropping physical footprint of mycelium today. In the Blue Mountains of Oregon, a single organism of Amylaria astoyae, I think that's how you say it, the honey mushroom, spans over 2,300 acres, weighs roughly 35,000 tons, and has been silently threading its way through the earth for over 2,000 years, making it the largest known living organism on our goddamn planet. Crazy, no? But paleobotanical evidence suggests that in our ancient past, fungal networks dominated the landscape on an even more monstrous scale. Hundreds of millions of years ago, before trees ever evolved, the Earth was ruled by prototaxites, sprawling subterranean fungal networks that broke the surface as towering trunk-like spires over 26 feet tall and 3 feet wide. Horrifying. For millennia, the terrestrial world didn't belong to plants. It was a kingdom of giant, monolithic fungi. McKenna suggested that millions of years ago, these spores drifted across the cosmos, rained down on a primitive Earth, and unspooled these massive, planet-girding brains beneath the dirt. But the true core of McKenna's theory moves from physical migration to cognitive possession. There's that word again. He argued that the mushroom doesn't function merely as a plant or a drug, but as a symbiotic extraplanetary communications terminal. When a human ingests the fruiting body, I don't like that phrase, the chemical compounds override our default neural networks, allowing an ancient, non-human intelligence to speak directly to human consciousness in a voice McKenna described as a distinct interior logos. In this framework, the mushroom is a cosmic monitoring system, an alien artifact that uses the language of molecular chemistry to download alien data packets, ecological wisdom, and galactic history directly into the human mind, prompting our very evolution. Cue up 100 stoned apes on 100 typewriters, reaching towards the glory of the cosmos, and or bashing each other's brains out against darkly menacing, mysterious monoliths, and it brings us all the way back to today. It was the best of times, it was the blurst of times. 100 points if you know what that's from. As we now turn our focus to what may be one of, if not the most mysterious fungus of all, and the one that may provide strongest evidence that fungal intelligence can communicate with human consciousness in ways that we're only just very recently beginning to understand. In Yunnan province, China, there grows a mushroom that should not exist, at least not according to our current understanding of neurochemistry and hallucinations. Lanmoa asiatica, known locally as jianshuqing, is a bolete mushroom, a common wild food gathered by local populations. When properly cooked, it's apparently delicious and harmless, but when undercooked or consumed raw, it produces something unprecedented in the pharmacological literature: consistent, reproducible hallucinations across all individuals who ingest it. Specifically, It causes what psychiatrists call Lilliputian hallucinations, the perception of tiny human, animal, or fantasy figures. In China, these are called Zhaorinren, or little people. But everyone who's taken it, they all see the same thing. Consistency is what makes the case extraordinary. Most psychedelic experiences are highly variable, shaped by set and setting, your own fucked up past and trauma, individual psychology, and or cultural context. But Landmoa asiatica produces the same vision in nearly everyone who is affected. Hospital records analyzed by researchers show that 96% of patients reported seeing the tiny humans. As documented by Vice, BBC Future, Live Science, and Popular Mechanics, the hallucinations are remarkably specific. Tiny, elf-like figures, often described as 2 to 3 centimeters tall, climbing on furniture, marching in formation, scaling walls, and clinging to household objects. Coming to get your ass! No, I don't know. They're probably passive, I guess. I don't know. They don't sound aggressive. One local professor in Yunnan, as reported by Popular Mechanics, described seeing, quote, hundreds of Zhaorinren marching like soldiers, unquote, after eating stir-fried mushrooms. When he lifted the tablecloth, quote, the heads came off and stuck, unquote. Ugh. It's a real nightmarish image that suggests these hallucinations possess not just visual, but narrative coherence, which is also pretty fucking phenomenal. Here's the mystery. Landmoa asiatica does not contain psilocybin. It doesn't contain any known psychedelic compounds. As research published in ScienceDirect documented, the mushroom, quote, lacks genes for known psychedelics, unquote. Whatever mechanism produces these visions, it's not the standard serotonergic pathway that underlies the effect of psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, or DMT. Biologist Colin Domnauer, interviewed by The Microdose and Live Science, has been investigating this phenomena. As he noted, quote, at first scientists dismissed reports of these consistent hallucinations, as they tend to do, but the evidence has become overwhelming. In one study, approximately 400 cases in a single year showed that 90% of affected individuals reported the Lilliputian hallucinations. Sounds like a prog rock band. What is this mushroom doing? How does it produce such specific, consistent visions? Miniature little people. Little bitty humanoids, little middle of the model airplane. The current hypothesis, as reported by BBC Future, is that the mushroom contains some unknown compound or combination of compounds that specifically target visual processing and facial recognition networks in the brain, producing pareidoleic hallucinations that the mind interprets as little people. But this explanation begs the question, why little people? Why not geometric patterns, abstract colors, or the typical visual distortions of psychedelic experiences, but specifically miniature human figures, often engaging in organized activity? The answer may lie in the evolutionary relationship between fungi and animals. Fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. They split from the animal lineage approximately 1.5 billion years ago, sharing fundamental cellular machinery, including neurotransmitter systems. Many fungi produce compounds that interact with animal nervous systems, antibiotics, toxins, psychoactive substances, and so forth. This is essentially chemical communication across deep evolutionary time. Perhaps Landmoa asiatica has evolved to produce compounds that specifically interact with human visual cognition, not randomly, but in a way that produces organized, meaningful imagery. Perhaps the little people represent some kind of fungal attempt at communication, filtered through human neural architecture and interpreted through the cultural lens of fairy folklore and indigenous spirit beliefs. This is speculation, but it's grounded in the documented reality of fungal intelligence. If slime molds can solve mazes, if mycelial networks can share nutrients and information across forest ecosystems, and if fungi can demonstrate learning and decision-making without brains, then the possibility that some fungi might have evolved to communicate with animal nervous systems isn't exactly far-fetched. It is, in fact, exactly what we observe with Ophiocordyceps and their behavior-manipulating fungi. The only difference is the medium. Instead of motor control, Landmoa may affect perception, as far as we know, at this point, up till now. And here we return to the worm, or the worm, the O or the Y. And the deep, you can't tell, but I wrote it different. I'm talking about two different things here. has a deep connection between parasitism and mythology. Can't believe he ate the worm. In Old English, the word worm with a Y meant serpent, dragon, or worm, like with an O. Three categories that were not clearly distinguished. The Old Norse ormir and the German worm, both WYRM, both share the semantic range. As documented on Wikipedia and in etymological research from the University of Nottingham, the Germanic dragon was often conceptualized as a giant worm with an O, a massive serpentine creature that crawled, burrowed, and possessed the earth itself. The lindworm, or lindworm, various spellings, literally meaning ensnaring snake, is a creature of northern, western, and central European folklore that traditionally takes the shape of a giant serpent living deep in the forest. Sometimes it has 2 arms but no legs. Sometimes it's entirely serpentine. It is, as the Wikipedia entry states, a sort of dragon, but a dragon that is fundamentally worm-like, quote-unquote worm-like. The tatzelworm of Alpine folklore, also called the stollenworm or tunnel worm, is described as a lizard-like creature, essentially a sort of dragon, often said to have a cat-like face and the ability to expel poisonous fumes capable of killing humans. As documented by TVI show and in folklore studies, the tatzelworm was often identified with the lindworm. Both are wingless, associated with underground spaces, and are serpentine dragons. These creatures occupy a liminal space in the mythology, neither fully serpent nor fully dragon, neither merely animal nor supernatural entity. They are WYRMS with a Y, creatures that burrow, that tunnel, and that inhabit the dark spaces beneath the earth and within the body. The connection to parasitic worms isn't coincidental. Tapeworms, hookworms, pinworms, all are serpentine, elongated, wriggling creatures that inhabit the interior darkness of the body. They feed without being seen. They grow to lengths that seem impossible relative to their hosts. They exit through orifice, breaking the boundaries between inside and outside and between the self and other. Once again, this one doesn't make me sick, but the next one, it's going to be hard. Okay. Anyways, is it any wonder that medieval Europeans conflated these categories, that the worm in the belly and the worm in the mountain became conceptually intertwined? Both represent invasion from without. Both represent consumption from within. Both represent the terrifying possibility that the self is not sovereign, that the body can be colonized, controlled, possessed by alien intelligences that enter through orifice, through contaminated water, through undercooked meat, or through the very air we fucking breathe. If we look beyond Western Europe, this exact psychosomatic horror repeats across global folklore, revealing a universal human intuition that the monstrous and the parasitic are one and the same. Consider the terrifying legend of the Lambton worm in English folklore. Shout out to the UK listeners. A creature that began as a small worm-like thing pulled from a river, only to grow into a colossus that wrapped itself around a hill, blighting the countryside. What makes the Lambton worm truly disturbing from a biological perspective is its resilience. Folklore explicitly notes that if a knight hacked the beast into pieces, the severed segments would magnetically slide back together, seamlessly fusing back into a living whole. This is a direct mythological echo of real flatworm and tapeworm biology, where individual segments, or proglottids, possess a horrifying autonomy, capable of breaking off, moving independently, and leaving a trail of corruption in their wake. Ye gods! On a grander cosmic scale, Norse mythology presents us with Nithogr. I assume that's how you say it. I look up phonetic, and that's what it says. So, I don't know what these Norse symbols mean. It's all Greek, German to me. The great malicious worm that dwells in the subterranean dark of Niflheim. Nithogr doesn't attack the universe from the outside. Instead, it crawls through the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil, silently gnawing away at its core. It's a cosmic parasite, inducing a slow, weeping necrosis at the absolute axis of reality, causing the world tree to sicken and die from within. This reveals the core horror shared by both myth and biology. The worm, with a Y, is fundamentally an agent of environmental corruption. See, I always knew about, was it Jormungandr? I knew about that worm serpent creature, but I didn't know about Neathogre. Interesting stuff. In ancient folklore, wherever a worm with a Y made its lair, the surrounding landscape fell profoundly ill. Wells and rivers turned to toxic sludge, crops withered into black bullshit, cattle dropped dead in the fields, and a heavy, suffocating miasma settled over the valleys. The worm parasitized the geography itself, draining the vitality of the soil to fuel its own bloated, coiled growth. Ugh. There's like a... Whatever, never mind. I was going to make a stupid, hacky politics joke, but never mind. This is the exact macrocosmic equivalent of what a massive hookworm or tapeworm infestation does to a human's body. The internal worm hijacks the host metabolism, converts vital fluids into chemical waste, drains color from the skin, and induces a profound wasting lethargy, transforming a vibrant human being into a hollowed-out, living fucking graveyard. The macroworm poisons the province. The microworm poisons the person. But perhaps the most chilling parallel between the mythological worm, and the biological parasite is how their influence ripples outward to control the collective. In legends, a nested worm doesn't merely terrorize a single victim. Its toxic presence forces entire fucking villages to alter their laws, open up their youth as sacrifices, and completely restructure their social order just to survive under its shadow. In the microscopic world, this isn't a metaphor. It's a calculated, evolutionary, perfected strategy of control. The tapeworm. Here we go. Okay. Schistocephalus solidus. Perfect. Studied in research published in BMC Ecology and Biology Letters, demonstrates manipulation so sophisticated that it affects not just infected individuals, but their entire goddamn social group. Stickleback fish infected with this tapeworm show altered behavior, becoming more likely to engage in risky activities, but uninfected group members also change their behavior in response to infected individuals, suggesting that the parasite's influence extends beyond the individual host to reshape entire social fucking structures. Is that not insane? As the researchers noted, quote, the presence of tapeworm-infected individuals with drastically changed phenotypes induced behavioral alterations in uninfected group members, consequently affecting the entire social group, unquote. The parasite manipulates the collective, not just the individual. This is possession at the scale of society. This is demonic influence spreading through networks of relationship, reshaping behavior patterns across populations. The medieval fear of plague is divine punishment, of demonic influence spreading through communities. Oh, God is mad at us. These may have been pre-scientific attempts to understand phenomena that we now recognize as infectious diseases and parasitic manipulation. But we mustn't be too quick to dismiss the quote-unquote spiritual framework entirely. The distinction between biological parasite and spiritual entity may be a false dichotomy imposed by modern materialism. If behavior can be manipulated by microscopic organisms, if perception can be altered by fungal compounds, if distributed networks can demonstrate intelligence without centralized brains, then the category of quote-unquote spirit may need to be expanded to include these biological realities. Consider the paramecium, a single-celled organism that's become a model for understanding behavior without nervous systems. Research published in eNeuro and PMC has explored what researchers call the integrative neuroscience of paramecium, quote-unquote, treating this single cell as a swimming neuron, quote-unquote, a swimming neuron that can address fundamental questions about the relationship between perception and action. The paramecium can learn. It can discriminate between different stimuli. It can modify its behavior based on experience. As documented in research from the Psychological Record and BioArchive, these organisms can form associations and demonstrate what appear to be memory and decision-making. And they do this without synapses, without neural networks, and without anything resembling a goddamn brain. Oh, if only other people could. Yeah. The implications are profound. If intelligence, learning, and decision-making can exist without nervous systems, if they can emerge from the chemical signaling and structural dynamics of single cells or distributed networks, then the universe of possible minds is vastly larger than we previously assumed. The fungal network beneath the forest floor may be thinking. The slime mold solving the maze may be aware. The parasites manipulating their hosts may be exercising something analogous to intentionality. And if this is true, then Minakata Kumagusu's interpretation of his experiences may have been more accurate than modern science has acknowledged. The Tengu may not have been supernatural entities in the sense of existing outside of nature. They may have been natural entities, emergent properties of ecosystem intelligence. That his culture had conceptual frameworks for perceiving that ours lack. The kami, localized nature intelligences, may be exactly what the mycelial networks demonstrate. Localized centers of processing and decision-making that coordinate biological activity across scales of space and time. When Minakata spoke of the kami, pointing out rare slime molds, he may have been describing a real phenomena that coordinated activity of fungal networks directed his attention to specific locations where rare species grew, perhaps because those locations represented important nodes in the network, or because the presence of the rare species indicated specific ecological conditions that the network was monitoring. And this isn't necessarily mysticism. This is systems ecology, advanced to the point where the distinction between mechanism and meaning begins to dissolve. Love when that happens. We return finally to the question of possession. The documentary evidence is clear. Possession, defined as the takeover of a host's behavior by an alien entity, occurs constantly in nature. It's not supernatural, it's biological. But the biological reality may be stranger than the goddamn supernatural ever imagined. A parasite that enters your body, travels to your brain, forms cysts that alters your fear responses and risk-taking behavior, that changes how you respond to cat piss or how you navigate traffic. This isn't metaphorically like possession. This is possession. The only difference between Toxoplasma gondii and the demons of folklore is that we can see the parasite under a microscope. Take that, religion. The mechanism, entry into the body, residence within, alteration of behavior, and resistance to expulsion is downright identical. The hookworm. Fuck, here we go again. Okay. Ancylostoma duodenale. Fucking perfect. Documented in the Ebers Papyrus from 3000 BCE and still infecting hundreds of millions today. Enters through the skin, travels to the intestines, feeds on blood, and can cause cognitive impairment, developmental delays in children, and behavioral changes. The pinworm, Enterobius vermicularis, emerges at night to lay eggs around the anus, causing itching that disrupts sleep, alters behavior, and has been linked to psychiatric disorders in epidemiological studies. These aren't merely infections, they're colonizations. They're occupations of the body by entities that use the host's resources for their own reproduction, that manipulate host behavior to facilitate their transmission, and that resist the host's attempts at defense. And they are, by any reasonable definition, intelligent. Not intelligent in the way that humans are intelligent, if you can even fucking make that claim. Conscious, self-aware, capable of abstract reasoning, but intelligent in the way that solves problems, achieves goals, adapts to circumstances, and learns from experience. Velocifucking-raptors. The parasite that manipulates ant behavior to position itself for transmission to the next host is solving a complex problem. How to complete a life cycle that requires multiple species, using chemical and neurological tools that we're only beginning to understand. This intelligence is distributed, embodied, embedded in the material reality of cells and molecules and networks. It doesn't require consciousness as we understand it. It may be more like the intelligence of the immune system, capable of learning, memory, discrimination, and response, but without the centralized experience of quote-unquote self that characterizes animal minds, or, especially human minds, or, and this is the possibility that Minakata Kumagusu's work suggests, it may be that the distinction between embodied intelligence and conscious experience is itself a product of our particular evolutionary history, or our particular neural architecture, our particular cultural frameworks, etc. Other organisms may experience their intelligences differently. Slime molds may have a kind of diffuse awareness spread across their entire network. Fungi may experience time and space in ways that we can't even fucking imagine. Parasites may possess a kind of focused, goal-oriented consciousness entirely devoted to the problem of host manipulation. By the way, I'm cursing a lot in this episode, and I apologize if that bothers people, but I really feel like shit, and I just do it. It's therapeutic for me. I'm sorry. We don't know. No. But the evidence that something like cognition fucking occurs throughout the biological world is now overwhelming. And the evidence that some of these non-human intelligences can affect human consciousness through infection, chemical communication, and or alteration of behavior and perception is equally strong. This is the true high strangeness of the parasitic realm. Not that it's supernatural, but that it's natural. A natural world, far more complex, far more intelligent, far more interconnected than the mechanistic models of the past centuries have allowed for. We aren't individuals, we're ecosystems, walking, talking, thinking colonies of human cells and bacterial symbionts, and potentially parasitic invaders that shape our behavior in ways we either don't or can't even perceive. The worms within, the worms crawling, the worms crawl, the worms within are not merely biological threats. They're teachers, showing us the limits of our autonomy, the permeability of our boundaries, the distributed nature of intelligence and agency. The worm of legend and the worm of the intestines are one and the same. The serpent that consumes from within, that challenges our assumption that we are the sole authors of our actions. Minakata Humagusu wandered the forest of Wakayama in trance states, guided by entities he called Tengu and Kami, to rare slime molds invisible to ordinary research methods. He may have been doing something that our culture has forgotten how to do. Perceiving the intelligence of the non-human world directly, without the filtering mechanisms of scientific objectivity that excludes subjectivity from the data. His was a participatory science, a way of knowing that required the knower to enter into a relationship with the known. You know what I'm saying? This is dangerous by modern standards. It risks contamination, intellectual, spiritual, possibly even biological. But it may also be necessary if we're to better understand phenomena like the little people of Lanmoa asiatica, phenomena that resist explanation in purely mechanistic terms, precisely because they involve communications between species, between kingdoms, and between radically different forms of life and intelligence. Maybe this is the point behind Terence McKenna's intergalactic alien technospores, a way to prepare us for new and unusual forms of communion and communication. Both. The mushroom that makes... that was my attempt at a Terence McKenna. Not good. It's not good. Just forget that happened. The mushroom that makes everyone see the same thing isn't merely a pharmacological curiosity. It's evidence that communication across the species barrier is possible. That the fungal kingdom has evolved ways of interacting with animal nervous systems that produce not random noise, but organized, meaningful, and also even narrative experiences. The little people marching in formation, climbing on furniture, behaving with apparent intentionality. These aren't random hallucinations. They're structured, consistent, and reproducible. They suggest that the mushroom is doing something specific to the human visual system, something that produces organized perception rather than mere distortion. So what if this isn't an accident? What if Lanmoa asiatica has evolved to produce these specific visions because they serve some function in the mushroom's life cycle, a function we don't yet understand, involving perhaps the modification of animal behavior in ways that benefit spore dispersal or habitat maintenance. We know that other fungi manipulate behavior with precision, so why not this one? The history of life on Earth is the history of infection and symbiosis. Mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells, were once free living bacteria that infected ancestral cells and became permanent residents. Pretty fucking gross, right? Well, that's us. The human genome contains fragments of viral DNA inserted over millions of years of infection. We are, literally, the products of ancient possessions that became partnerships. Perhaps the future holds more similar partnerships. Perhaps the quote-unquote demonic possession of folklore represents a kind of failed symbiosis, a parasitic infection that didn't stabilize into mutual benefit, that remained exploitative rather than cooperative. It reminds me of another Grant Morrison, I think it was in The Invisibles, when they're talking about some guy like made friends with his cancer, and he made the cancer in his body like a familiar. This is very weird. This is whatever. The goal of the spiritual traditions that develop techniques for exorcism and purification may not have been merely to eliminate parasites, but to establish boundaries, to determine which internal entities would be allowed to participate in the architecture of the self, and which ones would be expelled. Get the fuck out of here. This is the deepest lesson of the parasitic realm. This is another reason I did this one first, because I can't see this shit. It doesn't bother me as much as bugs. I fucking hate bugs. It's the next one. Sorry, I keep harping on it. I'll get over it. The self isn't given. It's constructed, maintained, and defended against invasion from within and without. The boundaries between me and not me, self and other, between human and parasite, these aren't absolutes. They're negotiated constantly at the cellular level, at the behavioral level, and at the very level of consciousness itself. Minakata Kumagusu understood this. His protest against the Japanese government's shrine consolidation policies, documented in research from the Environment and Society Portal and History of Education Quarterly, was motivated by his understanding that the destruction of sacred forests meant the destruction of ecosystems that he experienced firsthand, as intelligent, conscious, and worthy of protection, not merely for utilitarian reasons, but because they were alive in ways that modernity couldn't and or wouldn't accept or perceive. He spent 18 days in prison for his activism, reading and searching for slime molds within the prison walls, refusing to be separated from the living world even when he was placed in confinement. His was a science of relationship, a science that recognized the kami in the forest, the intelligence in the slime mold, and the consciousness in the network. We don't necessarily need to accept his specific interpretations to recognize the validity of his approach. The world is far stranger than any and all of our precious categories and classifications will allow for. The parasites within us are more powerful than we acknowledge. The fungi beneath our feet are more intelligent than we imagine. And the boundaries we draw between the biological and the spiritual, between the material and the mental, between the self and the other, these may be the true hallucinations, the persistent illusions that prevent us from perceiving the reality of our goddamn condition. We are possessed. We've always been possessed by mitochondria, bacteria, the ghosts of viral infections written on our DNA. The question isn't whether we can achieve perfect autonomy nor perfect isolation from the living world. That's impossible, and it's unnatural. The question is, which possessions will we accept? Which symbioses will we cultivate? And which intelligences will we allow to speak through us? You know what I'm saying? The worm crawls in, the worm crawls out. The fungus networks, the parasites wait. And somewhere in the forest of Wakayama, in the mountains of Yunnan, someone enters a trance state and perceives what normal consciousness can't see. The little people, the guiding spirits, the living intelligence of the world that exists all around us, waiting only for the right conditions to make itself known to us. This is the high strangeness of the parasitic. Not escape from reality, but deeper immersion. Not denial of the body, but fuller inhabitation. Not rejection of the other, but recognition that the other is already within us. That we are, each of us, a multitude, an ecosystem, a temporary consensus among competing intelligences that have been negotiating their coexistence for billions upon billions of years. The show ends, possession continues. It's always continued. And perhaps if we learn to perceive it clearly, to engage with it skillfully, to distinguish the destructive from the symbiotic, we might find that possession isn't a curse, but just a condition, a fundamental feature of life in a networked universe where no self is an island and every boundary is a permeable membrane through which the world flows endlessly in and out in the great circulation of being, that circle of life that, Mufasa, that we're really only just now beginning to grasp. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. The world is, as always, far stranger, far more intelligent far more alive than we've been led to believe. As are we. And we ceaselessly continue to generate worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds. That's going to do it for this episode. Fuck, man. This is hard to get through. Just because I feel like such shit. Man, thank you guys. Oh my god. You guys are the fucking best. Jeez, I'm fucking crow. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I'm better enough to read the bugs part. I don't like bugs. And I found some really, truly fucking disgusting, horrible shit that we're going to talk about in the next episode. I'm hesitant to even call this episode Horrors of the Microcosm, because a lot of this shit is pretty wonderful. I would call this Wonders of the Microcosm. But people like horror, so I'm probably just whatever. Branding. Fucking what do I know? Anyways, but the next one, the next episode after this is most definitely fucking horrific. If you don't like bugs, man, I don't know. Just maybe forewarned is forearmed, foreskinned. I don't know the saying, but maybe you should listen to the bugs one if you don't like bugs, just to know what to fucking look out for on some of this stuff. Because, God, it's fucking terrible. It's fucking. Anyways, okay. This has been Kooks, Gregson, Iconoclast, a podcast. My name is Michael Huck. I feel like shit. Call it a night. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll see y'all on the next one. I love y'all. Love yourselves. Love each other. Take care of each other. We're all we fucking got. Sorry, I keep cursing. Sorry. Fuck. Yeah. Next time, the depths of deep weirdness to the peaks of high strangeness, the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. See you then. Peace.
I collect spores, molds, and fungus.